Mom, the $200,000, was it enough? Daniel asked, his voice casual, almost light, as if he were asking whether I liked the dessert, and for a second I thought I had misheard him because the words didn't belong in my life, not in the small, worn kitchen where I had just set down a casserole dish that had taken me 3 hours to make, not in a house where I still counted every dollar before turning on the heat, and certainly not in the quiet, careful rhythm I had built for myself after everything else had fallen apart. So I looked up at him slowly, my hand still wrapped around the serving spoon, and I said the only thing that made sense. What money? And the way the room changed in that instant was so subtle that anyone else might have missed it. But I didn't, because when you've lived long enough, you learn to read silence the way other people read words, and Daniel's smile faltered just slightly, just enough to reveal confusion beneath it. While across the table, Victoria didn't move at all, she didn't blink, didn't shift in her seat, she simply watched me with that composed, polished expression she wore so well, the kind of expression that never gave anything away and yet somehow suggested she already knew exactly how this moment would unfold, and I felt something cold settle in my chest, not fear, not yet, but something quieter, something sharper, like the first crack in a piece of glass you didn't realize had been under pressure for years. The transfer, Daniel said, frowning now as he reached for his phone, already scrolling, already searching for proof of something I knew didn't exist. I sent it months ago, Mom, the full amount, $200,000, for the house, for your expenses, for everything. And I could hear the certainty in his voice, the kind of certainty that doesn't come from imagination but from documentation, from records, from a reality that, apparently, I had never been a part of, and I shook my head slowly, feeling the weight of his words press down on me. Daniel, I've never received anything like that, I said, my voice steady even though my hands had begun to tremble just slightly, enough that I set the spoon down. Before I dropped it, I would know if I had. And there it was again, that silence, stretching just a little too long, filling the space between us like something alive, something waiting, and I saw Daniel glance toward Victoria, just for a second, a reflex more than a decision, and she met his look with a small, reassuring smile, the kind of smile that says everything is under control, the kind that makes you believe you're the one who's mistaken, and for a moment, I wondered if I was. If maybe there had been something I missed, some letter, some call, some detail that had slipped through the cracks of my routine. But then I thought about the past year, about the careful way I had stretched every grocery trip, about the nights I had turned off lights earlier than necessary just to save a few dollars on the electric bill, about the prescription bottles I had lined up on the counter, counting pills, splitting them in half to make them last just a little longer, and I knew, with a clarity that left no room for doubt, that no such money had ever reached me. That's not possible, Daniel said, more to himself than to me now, his fingers moving faster over the screen, his brow tightening as he read whatever he was finding there. I have the confirmation, the bank records, everything was handled properly. And I watched him, really watched him, the way a mother does when she's trying to understand not just what her child is saying, but what he believes, and I saw the shift happen in real time. The moment his certainty began to fracture, the moment the simple story he thought he knew started to unravel, and still, Victoria didn't move, she simply reached for her glass, took a small sip of water, and set it back down with careful precision, her movements measured, controlled, as if she were performing a role she had rehearsed many times before. And that was when I realized something that made my stomach tighten, not with panic, but with a kind of quiet recognition. The kind that comes when pieces finally begin to fit together in a way you can't ignore, because nothing about this was random, nothing about this was a misunderstanding, there was intention here, there was planning, and whatever had been done, it had been done in such a way that I had never even known to question it. Victoria, Daniel said slowly, turning toward her now, his voice different, more careful. You helped coordinate some of this, didn't you? And for the first time since the conversation had started, she hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough, it was more than enough, because hesitation, in a moment like this, speaks louder than any explanation, and I sat there, very still, my hands folded in my lap, my heart beating in a steady, deliberate rhythm, and I understood, with a calmness that surprised even me, that whatever had happened to that money, whatever truth was about to come to light, this was only the beginning, and they had no idea that I was already paying attention. I did not sleep much that night, not because I was afraid, but because something inside me had finally woken up, something that had been quiet for far too long, and as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I began to replay every moment of the past 2 years with a clarity that felt almost uncomfortable, like turning on a light in a room you had been walking through in the dark, and suddenly noticing all the things you had been bumping into without understanding why, because until that dinner, I had accepted my life as it was, simple, modest, sometimes difficult, but honest. I had believed that what I had was all there was, that if I struggled, it was just part of getting older, part of being on my own after my husband passed, part of adjusting to a quieter life. But now, that explanation no longer held, because $200,000 does not simply disappear, and neither does the truth behind it. And I could not ignore the way Victoria had looked at me, not shocked, not confused, but composed, almost prepared, as if she had already accounted for this moment and decided how she would move through it, and that thought stayed with me as I got out of bed before sunrise, the house still and cold, the kind of cold that settles in when you are careful with your heating bill, and I wrapped my sweater tighter around myself as I walked into the kitchen, where everything was exactly as I had left it, neat, organized, predictable, a reflection of the life I had been living. And I made myself a cup of coffee, measuring it carefully, the same way I always did, because even small routines matter when you are trying to stretch what you have, and as the coffee brewed, I opened the drawer where I kept my bank statements, the paper copies I still preferred over anything digital. And I began to go through them one by one, not quickly, not frantically, but with a steady, deliberate focus, because this was not about panic, this was about understanding. And as I turned each page, I saw exactly what I expected to see: small deposits, modest withdrawals, nothing unusual, nothing that suggested any large sum had ever entered my account, not even for a moment, and I paused, holding one of the statements in my hand, tracing the numbers with my finger, as if they might change under closer inspection, but they did not. They remained the same quiet record of a life lived within limits. And I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me, because confirmation, even of something troubling, has a way of steadying the mind, and I knew then that whatever had happened, it had not been an accident, it had been deliberate, structured, designed to go unnoticed, and I thought back to the few times Victoria had offered to help me with paperwork, always with that same polite insistence, always framing it as something that would make things easier for me, and I remembered how grateful I had been at the time. How I had trusted her to handle things I did not want to deal with, forms, documents, small administrative tasks that seemed harmless, and now those memories felt different, not because they had changed, but because I was seeing them from a new angle, one that revealed the spaces where something else could have been happening, something I had not been paying attention to. And I set the statements down carefully, aligning them back into a neat stack before closing the drawer, because disorder would not help me think. And I walked over to the small desk in the corner where I kept my laptop, the one Daniel had insisted I get a few years ago, telling me it would make everything easier, and I turned it on, waiting for it to load as I stood there, my hands resting lightly on the back of the chair, and when the screen finally came to life, I opened my email, scrolling through months of messages, looking for anything that might connect to what Daniel had said, any mention of transfers, confirmations, legal documents, anything at all, but there was nothing, just newsletters, appointment reminders, the occasional message from a friend, ordinary things that had nothing to do with $200,000, and yet Daniel had been certain, so certain that he had not even questioned it until I told him otherwise, which meant there had to be records somewhere, just not here, not in my world, and I closed the laptop slowly, my reflection faintly visible in the dark screen, and for a moment, I studied it, the lines on my face, the silver in my hair. The eyes that looked back at me with a steadiness I had not always recognized, and I realized something then, something simple but important. I did not need to rush, I did not need to confront anyone or demand answers, because whatever truth existed, it had been carefully constructed, and the only way to understand it was to move just as carefully, to observe, to listen, to let the pieces reveal themselves in their own time. And as I turned away from the desk, I felt that same quiet certainty settle in again, stronger now, more defined, because this was no longer about confusion, it was about clarity, and I knew, without any doubt, that the story I had been living was not the full story, not even close, and somewhere within that gap, between what I knew and what I had been told, the truth was waiting. The next morning I did something I had not done in years. I called someone before I had fully decided what I was going to say, and that alone told me how serious this had become, because I have always been careful with my words, especially when they involve family. But this was no longer something I could quietly think through on my own, so I reached for my phone and scrolled until I found a name I had not tapped in a very long time. Laura Bennett, Daniel's former assistant. The one who had worked with him during the years when his business was just beginning to grow. The one who had always been polite to me, respectful in a way that felt genuine rather than practiced, and I remembered, very clearly now, that she had been present during some of the conversations about helping me get set up, after my husband passed, conversations that at the time had felt overwhelming. Full of terms and processes I did not fully understand, which was exactly why I had stepped back and allowed others to handle them, and as the phone rang, I felt that same quiet steadiness I had found the night before, because this was not about accusing anyone, this was about asking the right questions, and when she answered, her voice carried a note of surprise that quickly softened into warmth. "Mrs. Collins, it has been a long time," she said, and I smiled slightly, even though she could not see me, because there was something reassuring about hearing a voice that had not been part of whatever had happened recently. "It has, Laura," I replied, keeping my tone light, almost casual. "I hope I am not interrupting anything." And she assured me I was not, and for a moment we exchanged the kind of polite updates people share when they have not spoken in a while, small details about work, about life, nothing that mattered to what I needed, but everything that helped create a space where the real question would not feel abrupt, and then I let a small pause settle between us before I spoke again. "I wanted to ask you something," I said, my voice steady, measured. "About a transfer Daniel mentioned, something from last year." And I did not rush the words, I did not fill the silence that followed, because sometimes silence encourages honesty more than pressure ever could, and when Laura responded, there was a slight shift in her tone, not alarm, not yet, but something closer to caution. "What kind of transfer?" she asked, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully now. And that told me more than anything she might say directly. "He mentioned $200,000, I said, as simply as possible. "Said it was sent to me, but I have no record of it, and I was wondering if you might remember anything about that." And for a moment there was nothing, just the faint sound of her breathing on the other end of the line, and then she exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that comes when someone realizes a conversation has just become more complicated than they expected. "I remember the transaction," she said finally, and the way she said it, quietly, without embellishment, made my fingers tighten slightly around the phone, because confirmation, even partial, carries its own weight. "Daniel asked me to prepare the documents," she continued. "It was meant to be a direct transfer, along with some additional arrangements for monthly support." And I closed my eyes briefly, letting her words settle, letting them take shape in my mind, because this was the first piece that existed outside of Daniel's belief and my reality. "And did you complete it?" I asked, keeping my voice calm, even as if we were discussing something routine, something that did not carry the kind of implications this clearly did, and there was another pause, longer this time, one that stretched just enough to feel deliberate. "I prepared everything," she said slowly, "but the final authorization did not come from me." And I felt something shift again, not dramatically, not in a way that would show on my face if someone had been watching, but internally, like a door opening just enough to reveal that there was more behind it. "Who handled the authorization?" I asked, and this time I did not soften the question, I let it stand on its own, clear and direct, and Laura hesitated, just for a second, before answering. "Victoria was involved," she said, choosing each word with care. She said she would take care of the final steps, that she would make sure everything was processed correctly. And there it was, not an accusation, not a conclusion, but a connection, a line drawn between what had been intended and what had actually happened, and I stood there in my quiet kitchen, the morning light filtering in through the window, illuminating everything with a clarity that felt almost symbolic, because for the first time, I was no longer looking at separate pieces of information. I was beginning to see how they might fit together, and I thanked Laura for her time, for her honesty, keeping my voice warm, appreciative, because none of this was her fault. And when I ended the call, I did not move right away. I simply stood there, the phone still in my hand, listening to the silence of the house, and I understood, with a certainty that no longer needed confirmation, that whatever had happened to that money, it had passed through hands I had trusted without question, and now, those same hands would have to explain where it had gone. That afternoon I did something I had not done in years. I drove across town without telling anyone where I was going, not because I was hiding, but because I needed to see something with my own eyes before I allowed anyone else to shape what I believed. And as I sat behind the wheel, the engine idling for a moment longer than necessary, I realized how strange it felt to question people I had trusted so completely, because trust, when it is given freely, does not come with instructions on how to take it back. It simply exists until something forces you to reconsider it, and now that moment had come, quiet but undeniable, and I pulled out of the driveway, the familiar streets passing by in a blur of routine that felt almost detached from what I was thinking, because everything looked the same houses, the same stores, the same small details of a life that had not visibly changed, and yet beneath that surface, something fundamental had shifted, something that made every memory feel slightly different when viewed through this new understanding, and I found myself thinking about the first time Victoria had offered to help me with my paperwork, how natural it had seemed at the time, how grateful I had been to have someone younger, someone more comfortable with systems and forms and digital accounts, step in and make things easier, and I remembered how she had sat beside me at this very kitchen table, her voice calm and reassuring as she explained what needed to be signed, what needed to be updated, what needed to be transferred, always using language that sounded reasonable, practical, beneficial. And I had trusted her, not because I was careless, but because I believed she was part of my family, and family, in my mind, did not require verification, it required faith, and that realization stayed with me as I pulled into the parking lot of the bank, a place I had visited countless times over the years, always for small, predictable transactions, always for things I understood, and as I stepped inside, the cool air and quiet professionalism of the space felt oddly grounding, because here, things were documented, recorded, traceable, and that was exactly what I needed, and I approached the counter with the same calm demeanor I had carried since the morning, because there was no benefit in appearing unsettled, not when clarity required patience, and when the teller greeted me, I asked if it would be possible to review any large transactions or attempted transfers associated with my name over the past year, keeping my request simple, straightforward, and she nodded politely, directing me to a small office where a manager could assist me further, and as I sat down across from him, I explained the situation in measured terms, not accusing anyone, not suggesting wrongdoing, only stating that I had been informed of a substantial transfer that I had no record of receiving, and I watched his expression carefully as he began to look through the system, his eyes scanning the screen with the practiced focus of someone who understands the weight of financial details, and for a few moments the room was filled only with the quiet clicking of keys, the soft hum of the computer, and then he paused, just slightly, before leaning closer to the screen, and that small shift was enough to tell me that he had found something. "There is a record here," he said slowly, his tone neutral but precise. "A transfer was initiated in your name, a significant amount, but it did not complete in the way you might expect." And I felt that same cold clarity settle over me again, because incomplete transactions do not disappear without reason, they change direction, they are redirected, rerouted, adjusted, and I kept my voice steady as I asked, "What do you mean?" And he turned the screen slightly, not enough for me to see every detail, but enough to indicate the nature of what he was explaining. The authorization was modified before final processing, he said. The destination account was updated. And I did not need him to say anything more than that, because the pattern was already forming, the pieces aligning in a way that no longer felt abstract, and I nodded slowly, acknowledging the information without reacting outwardly, because reactions can wait, but understanding cannot, and I thanked him for his time, for his professionalism, standing up with the same composed posture I had maintained throughout, and as I walked back out into the afternoon light, I realized that what I had suspected was no longer a possibility, it was a structure, something built step by step, decision by decision, and I understood now that this had not been a single moment of wrongdoing, it had been a process. Something that required access, knowledge, and most importantly, trust, and as I stood there beside my car, the keys resting lightly in my hand, I allowed myself one brief moment of stillness, not to dwell on what had been taken, but to consider what would come next, because whatever explanation Victoria might eventually offer, whatever version of events she might present, I already knew one thing with complete certainty: she had been closer to this than anyone else, and now I was no longer the one in the dark. When I got home, I did not turn on the lights right away, I simply stood in the doorway for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me, because there is something revealing about silence when your mind is no longer clouded by uncertainty, and as I stepped inside, placing my keys gently on the table, I realized that everything in this house still belonged to the version of me who had trusted without question, who had believed that help offered was always help given, and I walked slowly into the kitchen, my gaze moving across the familiar surfaces, the neatly arranged dishes, the small stack of unopened mail, the chair where Victoria had once sat with me, explaining forms and signatures with such calm assurance, and I could see it now, not as a moment of kindness, but as part of something more deliberate, something that required me to remain unaware in order to work, and I pulled out the chair and sat down, folding my hands in front of me, not out of habit, but because it helped me think, and I began to lay out everything I knew, not in fragments, but in sequence, because understanding comes from order, not emotion. Daniel had believed the money was sent. Laura had confirmed the process had been prepared, the bank had shown that the authorization had been altered, and the only consistent presence in each step was Victoria, not loudly, not obviously, but quietly, efficiently, exactly where she needed to be, and I let that realization settle without rushing to judgment, because conclusions formed too quickly often miss the details that matter most, and I was not interested in reacting, I was interested in seeing clearly, and as I sat there, I thought about the way Victoria spoke, the careful tone she used, always measured, always appropriate, never too much, never too little, the kind of communication that builds trust over time, and I remembered how she had gradually taken on more responsibility in small ways, offering to organize documents, to handle online accounts, to make calls on my behalf when something seemed complicated, each gesture reasonable on its own, each one easy to accept, until the pattern became invisible because it felt normal. And I realized that this had not been about a single decision, it had been about many small decisions, all leading in the same direction, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, exhaling slowly, because there was a difference between knowing something had happened and deciding what to do about it, and that decision required more than facts, it required timing, and I knew that confronting Victoria directly, without preparation, would only give her the opportunity to shape the narrative before I fully understood it myself. And that was not something I was willing to allow, so instead, I reached for my phone and scrolled to Daniel's name, my thumb hovering over the screen for a moment before I called, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted to choose my words carefully, and when he answered, his voice carried the same tension I had heard the night before, the kind that comes from unresolved questions. "Mom, I have been trying to figure this out all day," he said. And I could hear the strain beneath his words, the effort to make sense of something that no longer fit his understanding, and I kept my tone calm, steady, because this was not a moment for emotion. "Daniel, I went to the bank this morning," I said, and I paused just long enough for the information to register. There was a transfer, but it did not go where it was supposed to. And there was a silence on the other end, heavier this time, more aware, because this was no longer speculation. It was confirmation, and I continued, not rushing, not pressing, simply stating what I knew. The authorization was changed before it was completed, and I could almost hear him processing that, connecting it to what he had seen on his own records, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more focused. "Are you saying someone redirected it?" And I did not answer immediately, not because I did not know, but because sometimes the most important realizations are the ones people reach themselves. "I am saying," I replied carefully, "that the process did not finish the way it was intended." And I let that sit between us, because it was enough to guide his thinking without forcing it, and after a moment, he exhaled, a slow, controlled breath that carried the weight of what he was beginning to understand. "Victoria helped with the paperwork," he said, almost to himself, and I closed my eyes briefly, not in frustration, not in anger, but in acknowledgement of how long it had taken for that connection to surface, and I opened them again, looking out at the quiet street beyond my window. "Yes," I said simply, and there was another pause, longer this time, filled with the kind of silence that marks a turning point, and when Daniel spoke again, there was something different in his voice, something more grounded, more serious. "I need to talk to her," he said, and I shook my head, even though he could not see me, because this was where timing mattered most. "Not yet," I replied, my tone gentle but firm. "We need to understand everything before we say anything." And he hesitated, but he did not argue, which told me that he, too, was beginning to see this not as a simple mistake, but as something that required care, and when the call ended, I set the phone down slowly, my hands steady, my thoughts clear, because for the first time since that question had been asked at dinner, I was no longer reacting to what had happened, I was preparing for what would come next. And whatever that was, I intended to meet it on my terms, not hers. The following 2 days passed in a way that would have seemed ordinary to anyone looking from the outside, but for me, every small interaction carried a new layer of meaning, and I moved through my routine with the same calm precision I had always relied on, because there is a kind of strength in appearing unchanged when everything inside you has shifted. And on the third evening, when Daniel called to ask if we could have dinner again, I agreed without hesitation, my voice steady, almost warm. Because this was exactly what I had been waiting for, not a confrontation, but an opportunity, and as I prepared for that evening, I took my time in a way I had not done in years, choosing my clothes carefully, setting my table with the same attention to detail I had always believed mattered, because consistency has a way of disarming people, it makes them feel safe, and I wanted Victoria to feel exactly that, safe, certain, unaware, and when they arrived, everything unfolded with a familiar rhythm, the polite greetings, the quiet exchanges, the careful way Victoria stepped into my kitchen as if it were an extension of her own, offering to help, to assist, to manage, and I watched her, not openly, not in a way that would reveal anything, but with a quiet focus that missed nothing, the way her eyes moved, the way her hands lingered just a second too long on certain things. The way she maintained control of the conversation even when she appeared to be simply responding, and Daniel, for his part, seemed more subdued than usual, his usual confidence softened by the weight of what he now knew, and I could see him studying her in small, subtle ways, trying to reconcile the woman he believed he knew with the possibility that something had gone very wrong, and I did not interfere with that process, because realization, when it comes from within, carries more weight than anything I could say, and as we sat down to eat, the conversation stayed light at first, topics that felt safe, predictable. The kind of things families talk about when they are not ready to address what truly matters, and I allowed that. I even contributed to it, because timing is not just about when you speak, it is about when you choose not to, and then, as the meal settled into a quiet rhythm, I placed my fork down gently and looked at Daniel, not at Victoria, not yet, and I asked, in the same calm tone I had used before, "Did you bring the documents you mentioned?" And he hesitated for just a fraction of a second before nodding, reaching into his bag and placing a folder on the table, and I could feel the shift in the room. Immediately, subtle but undeniable, like the air had become just a little heavier, and Victoria's eyes moved to the folder, then back to Daniel, and then finally to me. her expression still composed, but now carrying a faint edge of alertness, the kind that appears when something unexpected enters a controlled environment, and Daniel opened the folder, laying out the papers one by one, transfer confirmations, authorization records, printed emails, each piece of evidence forming a quiet, undeniable narrative that no longer depended on belief. And I watched Victoria as he did this, not her face, but her stillness, because stillness can reveal more than movement ever could, and for the first time since I had known her, there was a slight tension in it, a rigidity that had not been there before, and I let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of those documents to settle before I spoke again. I went to the bank, I said, my voice even, measured. They confirmed the transfer was altered before it was completed. And I did not raise my voice, did not add emphasis, because the truth does not need volume to be heard, and Daniel's gaze shifted to Victoria, fully now, no longer tentative, no longer uncertain, and she met his look, holding it for a moment before turning to me, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, controlled, but there was something beneath it now, something less certain than before. Margaret, there must be some kind of misunderstanding, she said, and I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the statement without accepting it, because I had expected this, the careful deflection, the suggestion of confusion rather than intention, and I folded my hands lightly on the table, meeting her gaze directly for the first time that evening. Then help me understand, I replied, my tone steady, almost gentle, and for a moment, just a brief moment, I saw it, the smallest crack in her composure, the hesitation that comes when a prepared answer does not quite fit the situation anymore, and I knew then that whatever she had planned to say, whatever version of events she had been ready to present, it was no longer enough, because this time, I was not asking from a place of uncertainty, I was asking from a place of knowing, and that changed everything. Victoria did not answer immediately, and that silence, brief as it was, carried more weight than anything she could have said, because it was not the silence of confusion, it was the silence of calculation, the kind that comes when someone is deciding which version of the truth will serve them best, and I watched her carefully, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a steady attention that left no room for distraction. And when she finally spoke, her voice had softened slightly, taking on that familiar tone of reassurance she had used so many times before. Margaret, I handled some of the paperwork, yes, but everything was done with the best intentions. I was trying to simplify things. And there it was, the first layer, not denial, but reframing, shifting the focus away from what had happened and toward why it might have seemed reasonable. And Daniel leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on her now, no longer uncertain, no longer searching, but focused, as if he were listening not just to her words, but to what lay beneath them. Simplify what? He asked, his voice quiet but firm, and she turned to him, offering a small, measured smile, the kind that had likely reassured him countless times before. The transfers, the accounts, your mother was overwhelmed, and I thought it would be easier if everything was consolidated, she said, and I could see the logic in the way she presented it, the careful construction of a narrative that made her actions sound practical, even helpful. But there was a difference between simplifying and redirecting, and that difference was exactly where the truth lived, and I allowed her to continue, because people often reveal more when they believe they are being understood, and she went on to explain how she had adjusted certain details, how she had temporarily rerouted funds to manage them more effectively, always choosing words that softened the reality of what she was describing, and I listened without interrupting, my hands resting lightly on the table. My expression calm, because reacting too soon would only interrupt the flow of information, and when she paused, perhaps expecting a response, I tilted my head slightly, as if considering her explanation, and then I asked, in the same steady tone, "And where are the funds now?" And that was the moment everything shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention from someone who was not paying close attention, but enough that the careful balance she had maintained began to tilt, and she hesitated again, longer this time, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of her glass before she released it, and Daniel's gaze did not leave her, not even for a second, and I could feel the tension in the room deepen, not chaotic, not loud, but controlled, like a line being drawn that could no longer be ignored. "They are secure," she said finally, her voice still calm, but now carrying a note of strain that had not been there before. "I made sure they were protected, invested in a way that would benefit everyone in the long term." And Daniel's expression changed then, not to anger, but to something more complex, something closer to realization, because this was no longer about a misunderstanding, it was about a decision that had been made without his knowledge, without mine, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, allowing a small, almost imperceptible pause before I spoke again, because timing, once again, mattered more than volume. "Victoria," I said, my voice quiet but clear, "you were not given permission to make those decisions." And I did not raise my voice, did not add emphasis, because the statement itself was enough, and she met my gaze, holding it for a moment as if searching for something, perhaps doubt, perhaps hesitation, but there was none, and I saw it then, the realization in her eyes that the ground beneath her had shifted, that the quiet, trusting woman she had expected to face was no longer there in the same way, and Daniel spoke next, his voice lower now, more controlled than I had ever heard it. "I trusted you to help my mother, not to move her money." And the weight of those words settled heavily in the space between them, because trust, once questioned, does not return easily, and Victoria's composure faltered just slightly, not enough to break, but enough to reveal that she understood the position she was now in, and for a moment, no one spoke, the silence stretching out, filled with everything that had been said and everything that still remained unspoken, and I sat there, my posture relaxed, my breathing steady, because this was not the moment for anger, it was the moment for clarity. And whatever she said next would not change what I already knew, but it would determine what happened next. Victoria drew in a slow breath, and for the first time since I had known her, that breath was not controlled, not measured, but necessary, as if she needed a moment to steady something that was beginning to slip, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, less certain, though still trying to hold on to the structure she had built. "I did not take anything," she said carefully, deliberately, choosing each word as if precision might protect her. "I moved it, yes, but only because I believed it would be better managed that way." And Daniel's expression did not soften at that. If anything, it became more focused, more resolved, because the difference between taking and moving, between managing and controlling, had already been made clear, and I watched him closely now, because this was no longer just about me, it was about him understanding the role he had unknowingly played in all of this, and he leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands resting flat on the table as he looked at her with a steadiness that mirrored my own. "You believed," he repeated, his voice low, "but you did not ask." And there was no anger in his tone, which somehow made it more powerful, more final, because anger can be dismissed as emotion, but clarity cannot, and Victoria's gaze shifted between us, searching, recalculating, trying to find a way to reshape the situation into something she could still navigate, and I could see that she was running out of options, not because we were forcing her into a corner, but because the facts themselves had done that, and I allowed the silence to stretch again. Not as a tactic, but as a natural consequence of what had been revealed, because silence has a way of removing distractions, leaving only what is real, and after a moment, I reached forward and gently turned one of the documents toward her, not aggressively, not accusingly, simply placing it where she could see it clearly. "This account," I said, my voice calm, almost conversational, "is not mine." And I did not need to say anything more than that, because the implication was already there, and she looked down at the paper, her eyes scanning it quickly, before lifting back up to meet mine, and there was something different in her expression now, not just hesitation, but recognition, the understanding that whatever she had hoped to keep contained was no longer within her control, and Daniel spoke again, his voice steady, grounded. "Where is it, Victoria?" he asked, not as a question that expected negotiation, but as one that required an answer, and this time, she did not respond immediately. She looked down at her hands, then back at him, and then finally at me, as if weighing the cost of continuing to hold on versus the cost of letting go, and when she spoke, the words came more slowly, less polished than before. "It is in an investment account," she said. Under a structure that I set up. And she paused, just briefly, before adding, I intended to grow it, to make it more secure, more beneficial over time. And I listened to that without interrupting, because intention, however it is framed, does not replace consent, and Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in the effort to maintain the same control he had shown throughout. Under your name, he said, not asking, but confirming, and she hesitated again, and that hesitation was enough to answer the question without words, and I felt no surge of emotion at that moment, no rush of anger or disbelief, only a quiet, steady understanding, because by the time something is confirmed, the feeling has already passed, leaving only clarity behind, and I folded my hands lightly in my lap, my posture unchanged, my voice calm when I spoke. Then it will need to be returned, I said, not as a demand, not as a threat, but as a simple statement of what must happen, and Victoria's eyes met mine again, and for a moment, there was something almost defiant in them, a final attempt to hold on to the position she had created. It is not that simple, she replied, her voice gaining a slight edge. There are processes, timelines, implications, and I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging her words without accepting their weight, because complexity does not change ownership, and Daniel leaned forward again, his voice now carrying a firmness that had been building steadily throughout the evening. Then we will go through those processes, he said, but it comes back. And there was no room left for interpretation in his tone, no space for delay, and Victoria looked at him for a long moment, as if seeing him clearly for the first time in this situation, and something in her expression shifted, not completely, not dramatically, but enough to suggest that she understood the direction this was moving, and I sat there, quietly, observing, not needing to add anything further, because the conversation had reached a point where the outcome was no longer uncertain, it was simply unfolding, step by step, exactly as it needed to. The room grew quieter after that, not in a tense or chaotic way, but in the kind of stillness that comes when everything important has already been said, and what remains is simply the recognition of it, and I could see it in Daniel's posture, the way his shoulders had settled, not relaxed, but grounded, as if he had reached a point where uncertainty no longer had a place, and Victoria sat across from us, her composure still intact on the surface, but no longer as effortless as it had once been, because control, once disrupted, does not return easily, and for a moment, no one spoke, the three of us sitting at the same table that had once held ordinary conversations, now holding something entirely different, something that could not be undone or ignored, and I allowed that silence to remain, because there was nothing left that needed to be forced, the direction had already been set, and after a while, Victoria reached for her glass again, her movements slower now, more deliberate, and she took a small sip before setting it down, as if buying herself a moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice had changed, not dramatically, but enough to reveal that she understood the position she was in. I will begin the process, she said, her tone controlled, measured. It will take some time, but I will make sure everything is transferred back properly. And Daniel nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because at this point, words were no longer promises, they were steps that would either be taken or not, and I inclined my head slightly, accepting the statement without adding anything to it, because what mattered now was not what she said, but what she would do, and the conversation, such as it was, began to dissolve after that, not abruptly, but gradually, the way something ends when it has reached its natural conclusion, and when they stood to leave, the movements were polite, restrained, almost formal. As if all three of us understood that something fundamental had shifted and there was no clear way to return to what had been before, and I walked them to the door as I always did, my steps steady, my expression calm, and when Daniel paused before stepping outside, he looked at me in a way he had not in a long time, not as someone trying to manage a situation, but as a son trying to understand his mother, and there was something in his eyes that had not been there before, something quieter, more aware, and he said softly, I am sorry. And I met his gaze not with disappointment, not with judgment, but with a calm understanding that did not require explanation. We will handle it, I replied, and he nodded, as if that was enough, because sometimes it is, and when the door closed behind them, the house returned to its familiar quiet, the same walls, the same furniture, the same small details that had not changed, and yet everything felt different, not because something had been taken from me, but because something had been revealed, and I walked back into the kitchen, clearing the table with the same care I had used to set it, each movement deliberate, each action grounded. Because routine has a way of restoring balance when everything else has shifted, and as I placed the last dish in the sink, I paused for a moment, looking at the empty chairs, the space where they had been sitting, and I realized that what I felt was not anger, not even resentment, but something much quieter, something closer to clarity, because trust, once broken, does not simply disappear, it changes form, it becomes something more careful, more deliberate. And I understood now that I had spent too long assuming that proximity meant honesty, that family meant alignment, and while that may be true in some cases, it is not guaranteed, and that understanding, though it came at a cost, was not something I regretted, because it allowed me to see things as they were, not as I had hoped they would be, and in the days that followed, the process Victoria had mentioned began to unfold, slowly, as processes often do, with documents, confirmations, adjustments, each step recorded, each movement traceable. And I followed it all with the same steady attention I had given everything else, not interfering, not rushing, simply observing, because the outcome was already clear, it was only a matter of time, and Daniel remained involved, more present than he had been in years, not out of obligation, but out of a quiet determination to understand and correct what had happened. And as the final confirmation arrived, the one that showed the funds had been returned, properly, fully, without ambiguity, I set the paper down on my desk and sat back in my chair, not with a sense of victory, but with a calm acknowledgement that what needed to be done had been done, and that was enough. And later that evening, as I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I paused for a moment in the doorway, looking out into the quiet house, and I realized that while something had been lost in all of this, something intangible, something that could not be restored with documents or transfers, something else had been gained, something quieter, but far more lasting, the understanding that I was no longer someone who would simply accept what I was told, I was someone who would see, who would ask, who would understand, and that, more than anything else, was what would remain.